Hi everyone, thank you for being able to make it today to my PhD defense. Today I'm going to talk to you about analyzing climate risk to cypress swamps and pine savannas to the Gulf of Mexico coastal plain, some work that I've been working on for about the past 4 years. Now, as a geographer, I like to orient people using maps. And so the first thing I'll do for you is talk about the study area in broadness as the North American coastal plain. That's here depicted in green, and one of the reasons it's one of the coolest spots in North America is that it's a biodiversity hotspot. Largely because of pine savannas in the location, the diversity of plants, the species number and species richness of plants in this area is really, really high. Another reason it's a really interesting place to study land changes is because there's really high coastal land loss in this area, and that land is heavily forested. So it makes it a really interesting place to study forest change. And on top of all of that, it's understudied in the field of dendrochronology. I do want to reorient you a little bit better. This is, what I'll be talking about today is really a subset of the North American coastal plain known as the Gulf of Mexico coastal plain. And because of this coastal land loss, we get a lot of dying and really stressed trees. And when those trees start to die, they lose a lot of their foliage and they become something known as ghost forests. And a lot of those trees die as a result of saltwater inundation in the coastal landscape, sometimes because of changes in drought and flood stress. But ghost forests are something that we actually see all over the world. We're going to talk a little bit about today ghost forests here in the Gulf South, but really if we look all around this map, not just in the Gulf coastal plain, we can see ghost forests here in the panhandle of Florida. We can go west and see them in Texas. We can go further south into Florida and find them, and then all the way up the East Coast. Here, 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 and we can even move to the West Coast and see some here and here, largely because of tectonic changes. And then we also see some in Alaska, and then we even get some special cases as we move inland into the Great Lakes, inland Texas, and inland California. So this is not a new phenomenon. Ghost forests have been something that's happened ever since the coastline interacted with some kind of saltwater inundation. But one of the interesting pieces about this, excuse me, let me fix the camera. One of the really interesting parts about this research is that we're picking the Gulf Coast. And why would we pick the Gulf Coast? That's because, first of all, since we're already here near the Gulf Coast, it's easy to get to study sites. So a very practical reason why we might do this, but it's basically because we're close, we're nearby. If we look at the top right image on this slide, we can actually see that we can see a reference monitoring system. It's known as the Coastal Reference Monitoring System. There's about 400 sites that the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has set up throughout Louisiana. And these sites measure everything from salinity changes to vegetation changes to landscape changes as a whole. But we're already working here in a natural laboratory. So if we use a biological proxy, which we'll talk about more in a minute, we already have a lot of data to go by. And then lastly, we're focusing towards this area in the bottom right picture here, which is really an area of high rates of sea level rise. So I've outlined the southeastern United States in this red box, and you can see those arrows, those red and yellow arrows that are really indicating really high levels of sea level rise relative to the rest of the world. And I'm going to look, now that we're talked about what's happening now, we can project those ideas into the future. I want to go back in time and see how those changes have affected things in the past. And my choice of time travel is something known as tree rings. So each year, a tree puts on a growth ring. So a lot of people understand that if you look at the growth rings of trees, we're looking at the age of the tree. Well, I can also look at changes in those growth patterns through time, and ultimately what those changes in growth patterns mean are a change in environmental factors affecting the tree. So as you can see in this image that I'm showing here, some of the rings are really big and some of the rings are really small, and that ultimately relates to changes in the environment. There are some tree ring methods really inherent to every study we'll talk about today. And that starts with coring a tree in the field. That's that right image on the screen you see now. Eventually we take that tree core, we mount it into a very small mount, we sand that tree core, and then we measure the rings. So I talked about that size of that ring, we call it the width of the ring. That changes because of environmental factors. We can measure that using very specific methods and go back in time with some of these data. After we look at some of these factors affecting growth, So after we take these tree cores out of the field and into the lab and we've measured them, we can produce line graphs of each one of the tree cores. So if we look a little closer at this slide right now, on the left we see a lot of lines on a graph, and each one of those lines represents a tree core from one tree. Ultimately, we'll eventually standardize them around a single value so that we can average them all together. If I took just the results of one tree, that tree might be biased by some sort of disease or an insect, something like that. But our final measurement is to compare those tree rings to their environment. So we've taken all of these data in the field, and now we have that natural laboratory that we talked about earlier. We can compare these trees to their environment. I do want to mention some of the impetus for the research that I'll talk about today. This is a publication from my master's research that looked at pine trees in coastal Mississippi. And those pine trees right along the coast showed evidence of tropical cyclones in the past, hurricanes in the past. But what we really wanted to do was explore those data further and also see where else we might see these issues. So from that research, we kind of get some different research objectives for what we'll talk about today. The first being, can we reproduce these results in trees of a different species? And then can we also use the trees that we've already looked at? Can we produce some advanced methods to look further into those trees? And then finally, since we're getting a degree in geography today, finally, does the coastal process signal remain if we travel elsewhere? So does that spatial signal, is it just in this one site in Mississippi, or are we talking about multiple sites further down the line? Today's study sites we'll talk about are in the southeastern United States and the Gulf Coastal Plain, as I mentioned earlier. One site is much further inland than the others. That's Doyle's Bayou. That's the furthest left there on your screen. And it's the furthest north. It's the furthest inland. It's actually just up the street from where we're talking about today, or from where we're talking from today. We'll also move east from that to La Branch Wetlands near New Orleans, Grand Bay, which is from that original publication. That's the first one we'll talk about today. And Gulf State Park near Orange Beach, Alabama. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about Grand Bay first, and that blue dot you see on the screen is the study site from that paper I mentioned earlier. That's that previous study site. We are going to go back and look at those data again, but I just want to make mention how close this next site is to the previous site. So those were pine trees. Now we're going to switch to cypress trees. A lot of the closest trees to the coast here are pine trees, but as we move inland just a short ways, we start to get into some depressional wetlands where pine trees can't grow very well, but cypress trees thrive. Some tides do inundate coastal areas here, but for the most part, the only salt water that makes it up to these cypress trees is likely storm surge, some kind of storm surge. So this is the first graphic we're going to look at of an average series of trees. So I'm going to walk you through this slide really quickly. The black line that you see here is ring width. So how big the ring is that year. These are all averaged trees together. As that line increases, we have a wide ring. We have a really big ring, a lot of tree growth that year. And then as that line decreases, in the following year, we have a lot less growth. The red line you see on the screen is just a 50% spline to see if we can get some visual analysis of frequencies of patterns that exist in these trees. The other thing I want you to concentrate here on this graphic are these dotted vertical lines. Those indicate years of hurricanes at this site. 1969 is Hurricane Camille, so some pretty impactful storms. 98 is George. The 2005 hurricane season is here. And the interesting thing about these trees, that answer that first question, these trees follow a similar pattern as the pine trees did in that first publication I talked about earlier. So just to resum what that paper kind of talked about and what these data show as well, following some of the large hurricanes, tree growth drops. And at the same time, the biggest hurricanes cause the biggest drops in growth. And finally, where we're going to really continue some of this research today, is that some of the drops in growth don't necessarily correspond to hurricanes alone. So we're going to go back and make our first conclusion, fairly simple, fairly quick conclusion. Coastal dendrochronology can extend into new species and probably globally. So it's not just these trees, these one set of trees in coastal Mississippi that work. It's probably going to be able to extend globally. That's a really good first question to answer, because without that we can't try to answer this next question. So far we've looked today at ring width. And now we're going to go back to that original study site, that blue dot here, and we're going to use those same trees that we published in 2015, and I'm going to, instead of using ring width, use something known as stable isotopes to look at these trees instead. And why do we use isotopes? Well, ring width just tells us that the tree grew, and it really can't get down to the factors of why the tree grew well or didn't grow well. But different isotopes are linked to different physical processes in trees. So, for example, CO2 changes in the atmosphere, temperature changes might affect different isotopes, and what we'll actually talk about today is soil moisture, so this bottom one here. There is one extra step, well, there's a couple extra steps, but one important extra step when we talk about carbon isotopes. We're not just talking here about just measuring wing widths anymore. We actually have to remove some of the wood from that tree core and sample it in a lab. So this is just a really quick image, a really quick video of me drilling out a sample for some of the data you'll see in a moment. So just an idea of what has to happen after we do ring width and move on into isotopes. Eventually we'll put that tree ring that we just drilled into this little tubule down here, and we'll send that off to a lab eventually for carbon isotope analysis. So here is our first set of data or our only set of data for carbon isotopes for these coastal trees. We go from 1996 to 2015, and again we're looking at those wiggles, those lines. Each one of those thin gray lines represents one tree. So one tree, the carbon isotopes for one tree. The big black line, the thicker line, is the average of those trees. So it's good to focus there because it really represents a stand of trees, not just one tree. And just for quick explanation, as that line decreases, moisture stress increases. And so the way I like to think about it when I'm first looking at these data is to say, okay, down is bad and up is good. So through time, in total, the tree is actually experiencing less moisture stress. It's staying fairly happy And those highest periods of stress are 1999, 2006, and 2011. That's where that line really dips to low points on the graphic. Now I'm going to expand that into some spatial correlations. So I'm going to describe this to you really quickly. This is the correlation of that black line, that average, with precipitation values at 5-degree intervals. So red colors indicate positive correlation, and so basically what this means is spatially, as that line increases, precipitation also increases. So it really makes sense. The trees are happy when it's wet. That makes a lot of sense. That signal is spatially right over the study site. That study site is in the black asterisk, and so it makes a lot of sense that carbon isotopes are following precipitation measurements at this site. But I do want to make a note that soil moisture is not just a factor of precipitation. It's actually a factor of incoming and outgoing water. So we also have to look at temperature when we look at those data. And when I went further into this analysis, I chose to look at what we call a moving window analysis to see if those trees had changed their signal through time. And I'm going to describe this graphic before we get into the bottom line, basically. Again, red indicates positive correlation, and we're going to look at the x-axis first. That black box indicates the period, the window of time through which each analysis is conducted. And each one of those windows is 10 years. So this first one, I believe, is 1997 to 2006. And then we go all the way to that final window, which is 2006 to 2015. So each one of these blocks represents a 10-year window, and we move that window through time. On the y-axis, on the vertical axis, we're going to look at our correlation, climate correlation parameters. Each one of these parameters specifically is averaged data. So for precipitation, that's actually totals. But for temperature, that's averaged data for January through June, excuse me. The top is T-min, which is minimum daily temperatures, which is usually nighttime lows. The middle is T-max, those middle bars are T-max. That's basically daytime highs. And then the bottom one is precipitation. So if we looked at just one window of analysis, this middle window of analysis here, the asterisk shows statistical significance. So the only statistically significant relationship here is with nighttime lows, T-min. But ultimately what this means is the correlation analysis of tree growth from 2001 to 2010 and T-min for January to July is significantly negatively correlated. So when temperatures are high, that line decreases, which means moisture stress increases. So that's what we're thinking about. Still kind of the same idea here. But one of the interesting factors here is this bottom row. So precipitation is actually only significant. It is a positive correlation through time, which makes sense. But it's actually only significantly correlated with that last window of years, which is 2006 to 2015. So we don't see this signal going back in time. It's really a recent signal. But our big takeaway here is that carbon isotopes are following changes in moisture stress. And this is very typical of carbon isotope studies in the past. It's just very rare to see these studies in coastal locations. So just basically another big check mark for our research conclusions. That tree ring widths are not the only thing we can talk about here today. That we can probably look at other factors of growth like quantitative wood anatomy, where we actually look at changes in cellular growth. And we can also look at things like blue intensity, which is another measurement of light reflectance from rings, tree rings. But ultimately it's telling us that coastal dendrochronology is not just useful for ring width studies, but we can expand those studies to start to look at specific factors of growth. And then this final question requires a good bit more data than what we've been talking about. And so I'm not just going to mention one study site anymore or one species anymore. I'm going to talk about multiple species in multiple different locations. And we're going to start at the site closest to the coast. This is a site called Gulf State Park. This is a pine savanna growing right next to condominiums on the beach. So if you've ever been to Orange Beach or near Floribama, the Floribama line near the coast, some of these trees are growing 300 to 500 yards from the beach. And so you can imagine, certainly these trees are getting inundated by salt water at times of maybe high tides, but certainly times of storm surge. But when we look at these trees against storm surge, again, that black line is tree ring width, and the red line is averaged tree ring width, in other words. But the only two hurricanes that really stand out here are, or two hurricane years, are 1998, which was Hurricane George, and 2005, which again makes sense because that's a big year, especially for these trees. Hurricane Dennis and Hurricane Katrina were both major impacting factors to these trees in that year. But ultimately what we're seeing is that it's not just hurricanes that are causing low growth at these sites. There's obviously low growth at sites when there's not even a hurricane. So we really need to look further into why this might be happening. So I have a slightly more complicated graph here. This is Gulf State Park trees, those same trees I'm talking about, and I'm going to walk you through this image one more time. There will be a test. And the first thing we'll look at is these windows of analysis. So this is again those periods of time through which it's conducted. This is a much longer series than the 20 years we looked at for carbon isotopes. So each window is 35 years now. And now instead of using averaged data or averaged over multiple months, we're using separate months of analysis. The top where the black box is all precipitation, and the box marked B at the bottom is all temperature, maximum temperatures. I do want to make a mention too, this top month of analysis is current October, and we actually run all the way to the bottom of that list to the previous May. And the reason we do that is because previous year water that's stored in the soil allows the tree to grow really quickly in the next year. So we like to look at correlation analyses of the previous year because previous year's water is very important to trees. So for precipitation, that comes in really handy because the strongest correlations with precipitation are actually in the previous year's summer. This is the most stable through time, and it is the strongest precipitation analysis for these trees. The good news is we also see that for temperature. It's more significant or stronger for the summer, the previous summer, but it's also true for the current summer. And the reason I look at temperature and precipitation is because precipitation affects incoming water, but drought and moisture stress is also affected by outgoing water. So evaporation and transpiration, which are affected by temperature. When it's really, really hot, there's a lot of evaporation, and there's a lot of less water that stays on the ground. And so if we add those two together, those outgoing and incoming, we get something called drought. And so if I measure these trees against something called drought, or something called PDSI, Palmer Drought Severity Index, we actually see a whole lot of red. So positive correlation again. So when it's really wet, the trees grow a lot. And that signal is stronger in previous year's summer than at any other time. Again, what we're seeing is that it's not just hurricanes, but that drought stress is also very important. So now we're going to move a little bit further inland. If you've ever driven from Baton Rouge to New Orleans along I-10, there's some wetlands on your left towards the airport, towards the New Orleans airport is Lake Pontchartrain as you go over the Bonnet Spillway. And as you get closer to New Orleans, on your right is a bunch of dead trees, or at least they appear very stressed. This is an area known as the La Branch Wetlands They're owned by the Monteleone family, the same family that owned the Monteleone Hotel in the French Quarter and the Carousel Bar, just a fun fact. This is mostly a freshwater system, but a very important part of that is that Lake Pontchartrain is not technically a real lake. It's actually an estuarine system where salt water can come and go as it pleases. And we're just going to look really quickly at these trees, but what I really want you to look at first here is this period between the mid-1960s to the mid-2000s. That's kind of where we see a period of decline, eventually a period of recovery after that, but a large period of decline through that time. And I want to talk about something known as the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. I might refer to it as Mr. Go. But it was completed in 1965 to shorten the distance for ships to travel from the Gulf Coast to New Orleans. So if you look at this line here where my arrow is and you travel inland through that line, that's the Mr. Go. It gets you to New Orleans much quicker than the sinuous Mississippi River would get you to the Gulf or to New Orleans. And it helps ship traffic. But one of the things it did, since it's connected to the Lake Pontchartrain through the Industrial Canal, is it increased salinity levels in Lake Pontchartrain. So just through time, more and more salt water was able to get into Lake Pontchartrain. And by 2005, because of ship traffic and erosion from ship traffic, the channel itself was 4 times wider than it was originally built 40 years before that. Both scientific and non-scientific articles do put some of the blame of the destruction from Hurricane Katrina, storm surge from Hurricane Katrina, due to the loss of wetlands from the Mr. Go. So eventually, it was closed in 2009. And so I want to point those years out to you one more time, 1965 to 2009. And as I switch slides, we go back to that box, which is basically labeled 1965 to 2009. Now, I don't think in 2009, those salinity levels just dropped off completely, but what did happen towards the end of this record is that Bonacary Spillway, which brings fresh water from the Mississippi River into Lake Pontchartrain, did actually open more frequently through that period than it had in any previous year. So when we look at these data, I think a lot of that decline in growth is really due to anthropogenic modification, not just natural systems. But there is one really interesting or important natural system here that affects these trees. It is the Mississippi River. And these trees are positively correlated to Mississippi River floods in the spring. So as the Mississippi River floods are really, really high, a lot of that fresh water is dealt around the coast, and these trees probably really like it. It displaces some of the salt water in Lake Pontchartrain, and so you see a good growth in years of high river discharge. And I want to end with this final inland location known as Doyle's Bayou. This is a site just north of here at LSU, about a 10-minute drive. And I do want to acknowledge that these data were gathered by students in the Coastal Roots program. The LSU Coastal Roots program that allows 8th grade students, in this case, to plant trees at local restoration sites. And we came to them and said, hey, would y'all like to also take some tree cores at those sites and learn about the past? They said yes, so it's awesome. I do want to make mention that this is not a coastal site, but I do want to see if I can still see those coastal systems. I'm not going to see a saltwater signal here. There's not much salt water here, but there are some coastal processes that make their way inland. And one of those coastal processes is evidenced, I think, by these trees. So same kind of image you've seen before. Each one of those black vertical lines represents, well, I'll tell you the years first. Those years are 1992, 2005, and 2008. And if you were living here at the time in Baton Rouge, you know that those are very important hurricane years for Baton Rouge. Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Katrina, and Hurricane Gustav. Those are some of the most destructive hurricanes on record in the past 30 years in Baton Rouge. And if you look at wind records, those are the highest wind records of any hurricanes impacting Baton Rouge. And by like an order of 3 standard deviations, these are followed by the 3 lowest years of growth for these trees. So again, we're not talking about like direct coastal processes affecting these trees, but it is very important to note that it's not just hurricanes or it's not just the coastal trees that some of these coastal processes are affecting. And we might see some of these signals further inland. So just that final conclusion, answering that final conclusion, global sea level rise is not only affecting trees touching coastlines, that it doesn't have to be a tree like at Gulf State Park that's right behind a condominium, right? It's just upstream from a dune and gets pummeled by every hurricane that comes through. And we might see a lot of coastal processes affecting trees inland, especially if there's anthropogenic modification there. And when we mention anthropogenic modification, I can't help but bring up something called the Coastal Master Plan, which was proposed by the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. It's about a 50-year budget plan for about budgeted, again, $50 billion. There are lots of different projects talked about in the Coastal Master Plan that you can see here in this image that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. But I do want to outline two of those plans that are either underrepresented, I would say, or aren't mentioned at all in some of the Coastal Master Plan that I think some of these data support. The first of those is planting trees. I believe this is mentioned in a hundreds of pages document 4 times. And planting trees is really vital to continuing regeneration in places where anthropogenic modification makes it difficult for natural regeneration. So we've done a lot of cypress logging in Louisiana, and that has changed the landscape drastically, but we do want to see if those trees can survive at a young age and grow up to sustain these wetlands. Now with that comes anthropogenic modification of the river. And this is actually something that's a big deal in the Coastal Master Plan, especially when we talk about sediment diversions, which are down here at the bottom here. These are 2 sediment diversions that are in the works right now. And those sediment diversions go directly into marshes, coastal marshes, to build land by literally piling sediment on top of itself. There are also a number of freshwater wetland or freshwater diversions that empty into coastal marshes to restore in a very different way. They work pretty much as intended, but they empty into coastal marshes. There's not many trees where a lot of these are already occurring. So this is Davis Pond, this top right image that I'm showing here. And one of the things that I think the research that I'm talking about today supports is that we need fresh water not just in the coastal marsh systems, but we also need that fresh water in coastal swamp systems. And those coastal swamp systems can make it much further inland than the marsh systems do. So I would argue that the LSU lakes were probably once flooded by the Mississippi River on very high floods. Eventually that's a changed ecosystem, anthropogenically modified, but that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about. Bringing some fresh water into cypress swamps along the river. Luckily, the state legislature, state government has listened to me, my fine wisdom, and they, as I was making this PowerPoint 2 weeks ago, the state actually accepted that they would pay $130 million into the Maurepas Swamp, creating a diversion from the Mississippi River into Maurepas Swamp. So some really good news there, and I think a lot of the research that I've talked about today is a really good piece of research to support projects like this. I do want to finally acknowledge a lot of the people. This looks like a busy, intimidating slide. It's supposed to. On the far left there are a lot of my funding agencies that allow this research to continue through time, and on the far right are all of my committee members that have guided me through this research. Towards the center are different organizations that have helped me communicate my research, get it out to the public. Some people who have taught me things at LSU, people at LSU could not have taught me, and then of course right there directly in the center, people who've kept me sane throughout the time period. So with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you again for coming.